Hi, everyone. Welcome to week 4 of Bite Size Nutrition. Today, we are going to be talking about carbohydrates. So, while we were waiting on everyone to get logged in here to Zoom, I had a question for the chat. So, I used to do this when I was doing distance learning as a high school teacher. I would put in a question just to make it a little less awkward as we start. So, have you ever done a low carb diet before? What were the results? Did it last? How did you feel? And so I'm looking in the chat and I see, mostly people say that they did not feel very good on a low carb diet or that it worked, but it didn't last. A couple of people said they felt great on it. So I think that's really important to note because there's going to be a little bit of a theme here about biochemical individuality and how different people react differently to different nutrients. Okay, so when I go to talk about any diet, I want to start by looking at what the standard American diet is. So you can see here, and I've seen a few different figures, and the values vary slightly, but this large percentage of our calories in America are coming from processed foods. Okay, very low in fruits and vegetables. So we can see that it's very low in fiber, um, high in meat and eggs, so like higher in saturated fats, which and cholesterol, which can be concerning. And so I bring this up because if you are going to make any change to any diet, you're probably making an improvement from what is happening here. And this is no judgment at all. I ate this diet for probably 29 years. So um, I get it. This is how we eat here. And so I'm just want to point out when you hear about any diet and when you hear that people had all this success, that um, when you are making any change from this, you probably are going to see results. And it doesn't mean that that diet is the answer and it's the be all end all. And that's what everybody should be doing. Okay. So the standard American diet, this situation where we're eating lots of processed foods, lots of saturated fats, not a lot of unsaturated healthy fats, low in fiber and phytonutrients. We unaffectionately call this standard American diet, also known as SAD. So that is what we call it in the literature. That is how you will see it abbreviated in the nutrition papers. I always think it's kind of funny, but I digress. Okay, so I mentioned the processed oils, right? That was a part of our concern. So I just really quickly want to say why that's an issue. So when we process them, we change the structure. And when we change the structure, these slight differences in structure make a difference between in how it's processed in our body and whether or not it's beneficial. So, sorry. So that's why we're concerned about processed oils and unhealthy fats. I could do a class on that in the future, so I'll skip through that. And let's get to the part of the processed foods that relates to what we are discussing today, carbohydrates. So processed or refined carbohydrates, what we do here is we take our like whole grains, so this could be rice or wheat, whatever the case may be, and we strip it of its nutrients. So you can see that some of these layers that get removed are filled with lots of fiber and vitamins and minerals and phytonutrients. So this is really not a good thing to do. Why we do this? And I saw that in the chat. I might need to look more into it, but I'm guessing for the taste, or maybe it makes it more shelf stable. I'm not sure. I would have to get back to you on that. That's a good question. Very good question. But that is what we do. So what we're talking about here is like brown rice versus white rice, wheat bread versus white bread, wheat pasta versus white pasta, things like that. Okay. So these whole grains is what we're going to call our complex carbohydrates, which we discussed in the fiber workshop in week 1. And then we talked about simple carbohydrates, which would be this situation over here. Okay. So here's another little graphic. So I was just discussing in terms of the grains, right? Because these grains could be, if they're refined grains, then they're going to be more on the simple carbohydrate train versus the complex carbohydrate chain. Okay, so our simple carbohydrates, they are going to be these smaller sugar molecules. Again, we talked about this in the fiber class. You can go revisit that. Um, Simple carbohydrates are going to contain one sugar or just two. So the foods that are going to contain them, if we have processed or refined grains, or foods that have added sugars, those are our foods with simple carbohydrates. You see things like candy here, soda, sugar, juice, things like that. And then versus our complex carbohydrates, it's these long chains of these sugar molecules. Okay. And because they are such long chains, they're going to take more time to break down in our body, right? We have to break all these different bonds. Also, these foods are often accompanied by fiber. Okay, the foods that contain complex carbohydrates usually have fiber too. So if you go back and watch week 1, you'll see that there's a ton of benefits to fiber, including result having these sugars break down slower. And that's going to be a good thing because we don't want to be spiking blood sugar levels. They are going to prevent the digestive enzymes from breaking them down very quickly. They might even trap these molecules and just carry them through the digestive system. So that's some benefits there. Okay, do want to point out that we have fruit over here, and fruit does contain simple carbohydrates, but it also contains fiber. So this isn't going to be a problem. Okay. So our simple carbohydrates, again, are going to be like candy, ice cream, juice, soda, um, white bread, white rice, white pasta, tortillas, things like that. And then we can have our complex versions where they don't strip the grain, or we're eating just our whole foods, our fruits and vegetables, our uh, beans and nuts, all those good things. So what's the difference between these? Well, as I mentioned, the the big complex carbohydrates, they have all those bonds to break, right? So they're we call what we call low glycemic index. It's going to take longer to break down, so blood sugar levels are going to rise and fall slowly. And it's going to take time. Versus when you consume simple carbohydrates, we are going to have a big spike in blood sugar, and then it's going to drop more quickly. So this is going to result in you feeling like you can have like that sugar crash, and then you might feel hungry again sooner. So it's not a good thing. And then in terms of like our hormones, insulin and things like that, we don't want to be having this spike in blood sugar, especially if you have concerns about blood sugar because you are pre-diabetic or you have diabetes. Okay, so I was just talking about whole grains. So I want to point out, as I mentioned in the fiber um, video, that we have very misleading nutrition labels. So sometimes you'll see things like Pop Tarts with whole grains and Cinnamon Toast Crunch with whole grain, Goldfish. So these unhealthy processed foods that are with whole grains. But does that make them a complex carbohydrate? No. They might contain some complex carbohydrates, but they also contain a lot of refined carbohydrates, a lot of sugar. This is going to have a negative impact on your blood sugar levels, which is not the ideal situation, especially if you want to be losing weight or you're worried about your health. When blood sugar levels are high, we release insulin. And insulin is what we call an anabolic hormone. So it's going to cause us to do reactions that build things up, build molecules like fat, for example. Versus when we don't have insulin present, we may have glucagon, which is the opposite hormone, and that's going to be a situation where we might end up breaking down, doing catabolic functions like breaking down fats. So this is cellular respiration. And cellular respiration is the way that our cells prefer to make energy. So we make that in the form of ATP. So I showed the reactions last week. There's all these reactions that occur um, in this process. And in the end, we are making energy. So there are some cells in the body that actually only can make energy from glucose. But a lot of our other cells can also use other sources like protein or fats. So what's important about this is, yes, we have other ways that we can make energy, but we do have some cells that really, 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 really need glucose. And so this is where we might have those effects of, I think, of people getting really tired and feeling lethargic and such when they are on a low carbohydrate diet, because our body has to work really, really hard now to make glucose from other molecules through a process called gluconeogenesis. So you're having to just do all these other extra reactions to account for the fact that you're not taking in carbohydrates. So where I'm at here is that our bodies are meant to use glucose, and we're meant to consume carbohydrates, but what's important is what kind of carbohydrates you're consuming. Okay. So everyone wants to know the ratios. How much of each, how many grams of carbohydrates do I need compared to how many grams of protein? And I see all these graphics on Google Images, and I'm like, I don't know. So definitely, I think there's, a case to be made that when you're trying to increase your muscle, sure, like you should be eating a higher amount of carbohydrates. But I don't think you have to eat a really low amount of carbohydrates to get lean. As long as you're eating the right kinds of carbohydrates, you're not going to be seeing the issues with blood glucose, which could lead to obesity and just endocrine dysfunction. So I think that this is a spot where I say, okay, you need to experiment and you need to try different amounts of carbohydrates. There's been times in my life where I felt like, hey, like I am doing better when I eat my carbs early in the day or when I eat them later in the day. And I have had success losing weight by mostly eating carbohydrates and ate them at every meal, as long as I was eating the healthy ones. So you need to see what works best for you. And I used this next graphic in my Facebook posts because I know that a lot of people can echo my concerns. A lot of people don't feel good on a low carbohydrate diet. And so it's not going to be sustainable. But I will talk in a moment about the keto diet and how it works and why it works. Because it's not to say that low carbohydrates don't work to lose weight. But we also need to consider, is it because you're maximizing ketosis, which we'll be talking about in a second, or is it because you are not consuming those refined carbohydrates that we know are not good for our blood sugar levels? So I know that people like numbers. They want to know exactly how much to consume of each thing. But the reason why there is no answer that I can give to you guys is because we have genetic variations. So I want to point out that I am not telling everyone that they should go out and get one of these genetic reports. I'm a giant nerd and I'm taking a class in nutrigenomics right now. So I wanted to get one of these reports myself. But a very, very small percentage of the population is actually going to benefit from or going to have any kind of like major life-changing information come out of one of these reports. There is occasionally people who have a genetic variation that is preventing them from maybe processing certain vitamins, and we need to treat that with a mega dose. But that you would know if you had some sort of health problem, most likely. So these genetic variations are called SNPs, single nucleotide polymorphism. So I just decided to pull up my carbohydrate report. But you can see that there's certain genes that are associated with carbohydrate metabolism. And I have three of the genetic variations. So you might have some of them, you might have none of them. It might impact your ability to process carbohydrates, but you don't need an expensive genetic test to determine that. I just wanted to demonstrate that there are differences for people. And um, the other thing that you need to consider is that just because you have a genetic variation doesn't mean that that gene is turned on, because genes can actually be turned on and off, right? So again, I'm trying to show you there's some biochemical individuality. Some people differ a little bit, and that's why you don't need a genetic test to tell you. You just need to listen to your body and see what works best for you. Okay. Okay, keto diet. I always think of bacon when I think of the keto diet, because I think a lot of people have this idea that they love these types of diets because they just say, okay, just no carbs, but you can have cheese and you can have bacon, you can have sausage, and you can eat all these delicious things. And I call this dirty keto. My concerns about this, thinking back to fiber, thinking back to our lesson on phytonutrients. If you're just trying to do no carbs, a lot of times people eliminate fruits and vegetables. And then what are we doing to our microbiome when we're not consuming fiber and we're not consuming phytonutrients, which we know feed our microbiome and that's responsible for a lot of our metabolism? What are you doing to your cholesterol levels by eating these diets that are high in saturated fats and and have all these carcinogenic molecules, and meaning it can cause cancer or things that are going to cause inflammation? So I will talk in a moment after I explain how the keto diet works, how we can modify this to be something that I would support. Okay. So, scary diagram. I always have to throw one in, right? Okay. So I said that our cells like to use glucose for energy. In certain situations, glucose isn't available, or we're in some sort of metabolic state, like doing like aerobic exercise, where instead we'll use fats for energy. So the idea here is that if we are not consuming carbohydrates and there's none available, that we'll move to breaking down fats. Okay. And what's going to happen is those fats are going to get broken down, and they can either go through cellular respiration, or some of them will be converted into ketones. So this process is meant to be kind of for emergencies, because the emergency is that your brain only runs off of glucose. Let me switch to the next slide. Okay. So I say, think about this like as this picky kid who only wants to have glucose, right? Your kid who only wants to eat chicken nuggets for dinner. They really need glucose. They can't use they can't use fats, and they can't use protein. So that's why your liver will instead produce these ketones, which your brain can use for fuel. Okay. So again, we are saying that we're in a situation where glucose isn't available. Your body is going to break down fats and make ketones. So people can test to see if they're in ketosis by doing like a finger prick test for their blood with a special meter. That is one way to do it. That's a better way to do it. You can do the urine test strips, which are not very accurate. And then there's also, because it's only a short period of time that you see the ketones in your urine. So you want to test your blood. And then they also have breath tests if you're going to be real serious and get something like that. Here's a problem. It takes sometimes a few days for people to get into ketosis, depending on how your metabolism runs. And if you eat just a little bit too many carbohydrates, you won't be in ketosis anymore. And now you're just suffering, doing all this suffering for no reason. So I think it's very hard to maintain. It does work because you are getting your body to go ahead and start breaking down fats to use for fuel, but it's not sustainable. It's good maybe short term. And there are definitely studies that demonstrate that this is helpful for people with epilepsy. I won't get into the reasons why. And, maybe short term to help with insulin resistance in diabetics. But in terms of if you want to, or if you're here to learn what strategies can I implement so that I can live a healthy life, this is only just a jump start here, but this isn't a way that you can live. And that's why all these diets and these things don't work, right? Because we're so restricted and you're having to, watch so many things instead of just learning like what kinds of food should I be eating. So now, as of today, you should be thinking like, oh, I know what kind of carbohydrates I should be eating and what I should be avoiding, right? We know from the other lessons we want to be eating lots of fiber. We want to be eating lots of phytonutrients. We can practice things like intermittent fasting. Those are things that you can always do that you don't have to think a whole lot about. And eventually it'll just become a lifestyle. But this ketosis is not a lifestyle. Some other concerns. I'm concerned about studies that demonstrate that the way that this diet taxes the liver, because we're depending on the liver to make the ketones, we're depending on the liver to make glucose since you're not taking any in. I'm worried about people who are doing dirty keto, as I mentioned, where we're just eating lots and lots of proteins and saturated fats and stuff like that. The proteins are very taxing on your kidneys. Another thing, there's been some studies that came out demonstrating that the telomeres of people that have been practicing ketosis for a long time were actually shorter than others. So what are telomeres? Why does that matter? Telomeres are at the tops of our chromosomes, and we've noticed that the length of them is associated with age. So the implication here is that we're saying that maybe the way this diet is taxing the body, and there's lots of different ways that could be happening through inflammation, through oxidative stress. But what's happening here is we're seeing that the telomeres are actually shorter if you've been practicing ketosis than somebody that hasn't at that age. Okay. So, Atkins diet. The Atkins diet was very, very similar to the ketogenic diet. Operates on the same principle of trying to just do low to no carbohydrates so that your body is instead burning fat for energy. My biggest issue with it is that they've created all these processed foods that they want you to buy to make it convenient. It's expensive, but it's not healthy. Okay. Another variation of a diet that is inherently lower carb is the paleo diet. And the paleo diet is okay. I'm pretty cool with it. I just realized I forgot to talk to you about how to make the keto diet good. I'm going to swing back to that in just a second. So in the paleo diet, what they're saying, the idea behind it is that we have not evolved enough past the caveman days to be consuming the foods that we are eating, and that we should be eating what they did at that time. So what they've eliminated is they've eliminated whole grains or all grains, and they've eliminated legumes or beans. So my question, why do we need to eliminate foods that we know have all these nutrients, all these things that are good for us? It's limiting, but it does promote more of a whole foods approach, which I do like. Now, you might be saying, okay, well, how is this a low carb diet? Well, because you're saying all the fruits and vegetables, right? So if you're eliminating grains, let's take a look at this. So this first one, sorry, it's covered up over here. I've got brown rice. This is the food label for brown rice. So a serving of brown rice, you can see the grams of carbohydrates, 33. For broccoli, a serving would be 6 grams, almond, 6 grams. So the whole grain options tend to be much higher in carbohydrates. So remember, the paleo diet eliminated that. So if you're not doing any, brown rice, wheat bread, quinoa, or any rice for that matter, any bread for that matter, any pasta, uh, you are going to be eating a lot less carbohydrates because they are just so much higher in carbohydrates. Doesn't mean that you need to avoid them though. So actually, this is a good place for me to talk about how to do the keto diet in a way that's healthy. So I would recommend ketotarian diet. So if you really want to jumpstart and you really want to try this ketosis thing, have at it. Maybe short term, cycle it, but do it in a way where you consume lots and lots of uh, fruits and vegetables and nuts, that so you're not going to be completely depleted of carbohydrates. You can aim to do, it should be, it depends on the person, where the cutoff is of how to get into ketosis. But generally speaking, you'd say between 25 and 50 grams of carbohydrates per day. Now, some of the literature debates this, but some nutritionists say to count the total carbohydrates, you can take the total here and subtract the fiber. So it's like, sure, yeah, we know fiber does reduce the impact of carbohydrates, but I don't know that we're like totally eliminating 2 grams exactly. So that's what's up for debate. But that would be when you take the total and subtract the fiber, that's like your net carbs. So you can say net 25 to 50 grams. So you can still eat tons and tons of vegetables, maybe some fruit, and still achieve ketosis. Q&A. So I discussed, the fact that I wanted to point out again that if we are moving from the standard American diet to any other diet, that's why we're going to see success. So it doesn't mean that that diet is the answer. Okay. And I wanted to point out again, it's not about whether or not we should have carbohydrates. It's what kinds of carbohydrates we should be eating. We should be eating carbohydrates that are not stripped of their nutrients, that do not spike blood sugar, and we're not going to have issues with our insulin. And we need carbohydrates because most of the cells in our bodies prefer to use these as a source of energy. Okay? And your body has to work very hard in order to counteract your choice to not eat glucose. We're going to have to make glucose from other molecules, and we are going to have to produce ketones to keep our brain running, which is meant to be an emergency situation, not a permanent situation. Okay. So go ahead. What questions do you guys have for me? Okay, Whole30 is not low carb, right? So Whole30, to my understanding, is eliminating your dairy, gluten. Yeah, so they can still have carbohydrates. They just can't have dairy, gluten, or soy. I want to say. I don't think it's a bad diet. I think it promotes eating a lot of whole foods. It eliminates eating a lot of foods that are not so good for you. So I'm like, sometimes when I look up recipes on Pinterest, I'll type in Whole30 recipes because I know that they're going to have some decent stuff. Is sourdough considered white bread? So I believe that the way sourdough is made, it's not as processed. I'm going to have to look at the nutrition content here. Because I'm sure it depends on how it's made. Definitely has less fiber. I wonder what I think on that one, it's probably going to just depend on how it was produced. Like what, let's see. I might have to get back to you on that. I know it has a low glycemic index, not a ton of fiber when I'm looking at the nutrition value here. I mean, to be perfectly honest with you, I think it is less processed. Bread is not ideal. It's not really truly a whole food, but it's not the end of the world. It could be a lot worse. And like it is something that I incorporate in my diet. But so is it less processed? It might, it depends. Depends on where you get it, how it was made. What kind of carbs are good to eat then? Vegetables, fruits, beans, nuts, and whole grains, quinoa, brown rice. If you can choose whole wheat versions of things like whole wheat bread, which it's not ideal. It's not, it is, some of it could be processed and have added sugars and things like that, but grand scheme of things, not the worst thing in the world. Whole wheat pasta, but again, it is still considered a processed food. So you want to eat carbohydrates that are high in phytonutrients and high in fiber. Okay, tortillas. They have the healthier versions of these, and it depends on how they were made. So some of them might be highly processed and some of them might not be, especially if you could just make some at home, like some really simple ones that just have a few ingredients that weren't meant to sit on the shelf for, I don't know, 3 months. What other questions do you guys have? Okay. Yeah, sprouted bread is great. I think it also depends on which ones you choose. They tend to be like whole grain and not refined. Okay, I was asked to go back to this slide about the glucose levels. Okay, so when you consume simple carbohydrates and you're not consuming them with that, they're not alongside with fiber like fruits and vegetables, your blood sugar levels rise very quickly, and so does insulin, and it gets all taken into your cells, and then you like end up hypoglycemic after that, usually when it has that like rush and then it all gets pulled in. Then when you are hypoglycemic and you have low blood sugar, then you might be more tempted to eat again, which is one concern about them. Yeah, so what would be better is if you are concerned about your blood sugar levels, like in terms of diabetes, that you would be doing complex carbohydrates because they're going to take longer to break down. They're usually accompanied by fiber, so that the fiber kind of prevents them from even being digested. It just slows it down. So blood sugar levels rise very slowly. So you'll stay full longer. You'll stay satiated, and you're not having those negative impacts of on your hormones. Does that answer your question? Cool. Okay, so yeah, I was just looking for eating ideas for complex carbs. If you look at my website and you look at some of the examples of the types of foods I make, they're all complex carbohydrates. I try, like, for sure, like when I'm hanging out with friends or like we go out to a restaurant, like a lot of times, I will end up eating some simple carbohydrates when you're eating, a hamburger with the white bun and or, a quesadilla with the white tortilla, get pasta, the white pasta. That's fine as long as you're not consuming that stuff all the time. So on my meal in terms of like what I prep for the week, I make sure that I'm choosing the complex version of that. So we're saying, white rice versus brown rice, white bread versus wheat bread, things like that. But you want most of your carbohydrates coming from vegetables. Any other questions for me? Alternatives to peppers, like bell peppers? Oh, you consider them spicy? I don't at all. Just says, oh my gosh, yes. Hmm. That's funny. Um, I don't know. I mean, just I don't know what I would substitute. Like I love doing like zucchini and squash. I love eggplant, um, broccoli, asparagus, green beans. And you can just find recipes where you can mix in lots of different, onions and mushrooms and things like that. But yeah, it would be really tough for me if I didn't like bell peppers. I use them quite a bit. No onions either. We'd have to do some individual analysis, but I think I have some ideas as to what might be going on. Do I peel the eggplant? No, I don't. Yeah, I keep the skin on it. I think a lot of vegetables, a lot of the nutrients are in the skin, so just keep it on there. All right. No other questions? I don't know if it's frustrating that I didn't give like exact values of how many carbs you should have, but I hope you realize it just really totally depends. Depends on how much you move and um, how carbs make you feel. And yeah. Okay. She says, not frustrating at all. I'd feel pressured to go by a number. Yeah. Yeah. So I love quantifying things. I'm a scientist. I love data and numbers, but it sucks to be confined by these things and it gets frustrating and it's just difficult. Logical. All right. Well, if you guys don't have any other questions for me, I guess we can go ahead and sign off. Thank you guys for coming. I'll see you next time.